Welcome to the Capula podcast, Ultimate Exchange. I'm your host, Stephen Lane, OT Cybersecurity Lead here at Capula. We have a special guest with us today, Julian Meyrick, Managing Director from Eraneos. Eraneos is a global management and technology group. Julian has a focus on advising boards on the potential business impact of cybersecurity and on quantifying cybersecurity risk in financial terms. He's focused on this since 2019. Julian has presented to CEOs, group management committees, and boards across Europe and represented the private sector on a panel at the World Economic Forum annual cybersecurity meeting in 2022. He's a fellow at the Institution of Engineering and Technology and lectures on cybersecurity as a business risk at Oxford University's SED Business School Exec MBA program, and at Trinity College, Dublin's Business School. Hi, Julian. Welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be joining you today.
In the second part of our two-part episode, we're talking about bridging the gap, empowering CISOs to communicate OT cyber risk to the board. This is something that if you're a cyber senior leader or a senior engineer, you definitely don't want to miss. In part one, we talked about risk quantification and we defined what it's all about and why it really matters. If you've not listened to that, then I definitely recommend that you go back and listen to that first. This is part two, and we're going to dive into cyber threat, and we're going to talk about the practicalities of implementing risk quantification. So in this episode, let's start actually by sort of framing this up in terms of the threat landscape in industrial cyber and operational technology. And I'd like to just contextualize it a little bit. I don't really think you can talk about OT cyber risk without actually talking about threat, ultimately. And I recognize that some of our listeners might really be from an engineering background. They might not really understand the threats that their systems are aware of. I did give a presentation on stage to a large room of engineers, and at the end of it, it was asked how many people really knew that those threats existed, and half the room put their hands up saying that they did know, but the other half were completely in the dark. So I think that's an important point as well. And there is another thing as well. Industrial cyber threats are invisible until something happens, the worst case happens. We can't see them. So we kind of need to bring those to light. We have a bit of a psychological bias as humans. If we can't see it, it just doesn't exist. So Julian, what are your thoughts on the main threats that any business with operational technology should be concerned with?
So unfortunately, given where we are with geopolitics, I think it's really important that we learn from the lessons from the war in Ukraine. The Russians have repeatedly targeted the electricity sector in order to disrupt the Ukrainian economy. We should recognize that there is a significant chance that that will happen to us. The Chinese have also been targeting US electricity and water companies with their Volt Typhoon team. So they've been positioning themselves to be able to disrupt OT networks in the future. So for me, it's important that we engage with plant managers, factory managers to really analyze what would be the financial impact of the cyber disruption to their OT networks. And again, for me, it's about using the business language of finance to be able to bring together the OT and IT teams to really understand what would be that business impact.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been recently, I read a couple of reports recently. I read the latest Dragos 2025 OT cybersecurity report that came out, and I read Radiflow's OT technology report, and there were some trends in there that I picked up on. I think the thing that I really picked up on is that ransomware is now a primary threat to the OT environments, and that there's been an 87% growth in attacks, mainly targeting manufacturing and energy networks. The other thing I picked up on is the increase, which is something that's coming out of the sort of conflict, the increase in specific malware that is targeting industrial control systems. We've had the Frosty Goop, we've had the Bucksnet, and the reality is this is highlighting that the attackers of industrial control systems have more capability and more understanding than ever before. And I think the big thing that I can summarize out of the two reports that I read is that the gap between OT cybersecurity threats and defenses is definitely growing. Attackers, as I've just said, more sophisticated, more motivated, better equipped than ever before. And our OT security, our way that we defend it, has got to evolve. But ultimately, of course, the decision makers have got to understand the risks, be able to invest in it. So, I mean, Julian, what are your thoughts about that? What are your reflections on the things that I've just said there?
Well, I think two for me. One is we need to recognize that, yes, originally criminals attacked banks because they thought that's where the money was. But actually what they have now realized is that, unfortunately, if you attack the OT system in an organization, it is so fundamental to businesses that they end up paying the ransom. And so it's become really attractive for them to target the manufacturing sectors and energy sectors. Secondly, obviously we don't want to go into a lot of detail on geopolitics, but for me, we need to recognize, given every discussion that's taking place at the moment, that fundamentally we have underinvested in cyber defense, and companies, need to recognize that and need to decide how they can protect themselves and build more resilience.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Let's jump into real world implementation. Because in part one of our podcast, we talked a lot about why risk quantification is important and why you should be quantifying your industrial cyber risks. Let's just get a sense and understanding of how difficult it is, I think, to implement. I think there's a possibility that our listeners might be thinking that risk quantification is complex, expensive, technical, and in the bucket that says too difficult. So what are your thoughts on real-world implementation, and how difficult is it to conduct a risk quantification exercise?
So for me, one of the things that risk quantification brings right at the beginning is a framework that really helps an organization, because unfortunately, risk is one of those words that we all think we know what risk means, but when you actually sit down with people and start saying, so what does risk actually mean to you, you will discover that it actually means very different things to different people in the organizations. And a classic example of that is between the OT teams and the IT teams. So having a risk scoping model that actually helps you define what do you really mean by risk is, for me, that's the first and most important step, because it helps the business and the IT and OT teams actually collaborate to identify, first of all, what are the key IT and OT assets which are critical to core business processes. And that is something that many organizations think they've done, but actually when you start asking them questions, they discover that it's not. And then the next thing is to have that conversation about what is the financial impact of that asset being disrupted. Then it's about what are the threats that could disrupt that asset. And then what are the controls that you've got in place to protect the asset? And if we define a risk scenario in that way, it's a clearly defined way of really understanding what do we mean and what do we think the impact would be. So it's bringing together the key people to discuss the potential business impacts. And then having done that, you understand what are your key risks as a business, and you can then build the plans to reduce those risks, and that can really significantly improve your cyber resilience.
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of power actually in bringing the tribes together to talk. And what I mean by that is that I've certainly experienced that there's quite some divide between OT, quite some divide between that and IT. And then, of course, you've got the leadership and top layer who at the moment think that cyber is something technical that they can push off to someone else. So just bringing people round the table to have a conversation, to define what risk is, what cyber risk really is, and to establish a common language in a common framework, I think is something that's really key. And I think that's probably a key part of risk quantification, let alone just the process itself.
Yeah, for me, it's important that the data is unique to the organization. When the board gets a risk number that they don't recognize, they're going to say, where did that come from? You don't want to be saying it came from Capula or Eraneos. You want to be able to say it came from this factory manager, this plant manager. We really, assessed what would it mean disrupting the business.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me, how can sort of CISOs or senior C-level individuals use the output from risk quantification to communicate effectively with their board? I mean, what difference does risk quantification make to them personally? So if I'm a CISO in an organization, what difference would that make personally to me? And, what are the overall benefits?
Yeah, so I had a really interesting insight from a CISO I was talking to a couple of years ago. And for him, he was CISO of a large global organization. He was respected by the board, but cybersecurity was basically seen as a technical issue. And so responsibility for cyber and for the business risks associated was effectively delegated to him as a CISO. He would come and present to the board and talk to them. But when he left, he kind of felt that, the risks were still on his shoulders, should we put it that way. By being able to present the cyber risks in financial terms, his view was that he would get a very different engagement from the board in the business decision process. So you can then explain the different investment options. You can then actually get the board to help make the decisions, because you're saying, we could do A, B, or C. And obviously you're going to make recommendations as a technical expert, but actually the board can actually say, well, yeah, that makes sense. We understand why you're making that recommendation, or even, what it makes more sense for us to invest more or invest less based on the business situation. So there's then agreement on the necessary investments that will mitigate those cyber risks. That's important from a regulatory perspective. That means that the board is now taking responsibility for cybersecurity, which a number of the regulators are now encouraging. But also it means for the CISO that, when they leave, they are actually, they're taking the actions that have been supported by the business leaders, by the board. So it's not just seen as a technical issue being, delegated without clear understanding. It's actually really empowering the board to make those informed decisions.
Well, I have to say, I think risk quantification sounds like something really powerful, something that is probably the missing link in a lot of organizations between board level executives who really need to make those decisions and those that are having to do the day-to-day job. With that, we're going to wrap it up. And I've certainly found the conversation very interesting and very illuminating. I think you brought some great examples to the table. And these are some of the things that I've picked up on. We talked about the cyber threats not going to decrease. We talked about geopolitics. We've talked about the gap between mitigating risk and the real risk, and the fact that actually in the real world that we've probably underinvested. We've given some real world examples of how risk quantification has made a significant difference, and some of the conversations that you've had, like with CISOs. And we ended up really discussing how presenting cyber risks in financial terms engages the board in their decision making. Thank you so much, Julian, for your time here and for sharing your insights on cyber risk quantification.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me.
To our listeners, if you're ready to start quantifying your OT cyber risks and communicating them effectively to your board, visit Capula's website for more information and resources. Be sure to check out our website, www.capula.com, where you'll find the latest news and insights. You can contact us through our website, and you'll find us also on LinkedIn. That brings us to the end of today's episode of Ultimate Exchange. Thank you for listening.